Hi all, welcome to week 10. This week we're looking at child welfare and child protection. Child welfare is my area of expertise, and for my professional practice career, most of it was spent in child protection in statutory environments, as well as child welfare in the non-gov sector. I know there are other child welfare practitioners amongst us within our class group, so please jump onto the forum this week and share any insights or questions or observations that you have on this topic. It doesn't need to be around the learning activity questions, but anything additional is fine as well. Today we're going to look at some definitions around child abuse, as well as some of the ideas pertaining to work within this field and some of the ways of working. I really like this definition of child abuse, as I find it encompasses, more so than others, the vast array and the breadth of actions or inactions, as the quote suggests, that constitute child abuse. Let me know what you think of this. Is it different to what you thought child abuse was? Does it cover things you hadn't thought of as child abuse? But have a read and have a reflect about it and where that stands with your understanding and your knowledge, and perhaps even with your reading for this week from the text. When we talk about decision making and child protection, it's not really ever based on one person's decision. It's not based on a singular viewpoint or one way of working. Decision making in child protection is generally multidisciplinary. What that means is we don't, as social workers or social welfare workers, make final decisions on child protection issues or for families who we're working with. We make some smaller decisions, but really it's a multidisciplinary field. You have OTs and you have psychologists and you have teachers all working in this vast field, making decisions and working with children and families. It's a multi-agency approach quite often. Quite often you find families working with a number of agencies, across agencies, and agencies collaborating together as well. You'd all be fairly familiar with the Keeping Them Safe report at this stage. This report came about following a child death, and the findings of the report were that there just wasn't enough communication between the agencies. This child had been reported a number of times to docs at the time. The child had also, child's family had been involved with other services, but these services and community services in New South Wales were not communicating. So there was a lot of reforms around this, particularly in New South Wales, but reforms in other states as well, which really clearly stipulate the need for agencies to work together in a collaborative approach. There's legislation pertaining to the sharing of information in regards to this. And I mean, at a practice level, I think we have a long way to come with this, but at least it's in legislation now and it's there as the sort of ideal way of working. I've put a little prompt question at the bottom just to reflect on in terms of risk assessment in child protection. Is this a technical endeavour, or do you think it's more a moral decision on the part of the worker? I know for any of you who are familiar with child protection risk assessment and risk assessment in the field in general, you'll be aware that sometimes it's quite guided, perhaps suggesting it's a bit of a technical endeavour, a tick box or that sort of approach, or is it a moral decision? Are we guided by values and ethics in decision making and child protection? Really interested to hear your thoughts on that as well. In terms of mandatory reporting, you should all be fairly familiar with the term from your textbook. If it's something that's new to you, please do some more reading. I've also popped a link at the bottom of this slide to the New South Wales Mandatory Reporter tool. So this is a tool for practitioners within the field to access when they are thinking of making a report. If they feel like they need to be making a report to their helpline to report a child at risk or who has encountered abuse or neglect, they can self-assess with this tool whether to make the report or what. It's also a good prompt for what areas to talk about when you get on the phone. When I refer to the helpline, I'm talking about a New South Wales terminology. I know in other states there's different names for the mandatory reporter line where we call in suspected or substantiated uh, abuse and neglect situations. So directly from your text is this quote with a typo, sorry again. The intent of mandatory reporting is to ensure that children and young people at risk of harm come to the attention of the statutory authority so that they and their families can receive services that will prevent the children from being harmed further. I think this is a really nice quote that's quite strengths based, and it encapsulates the idea that mandatory reporting is not a punitive method. It's not something to punish a family or a child. It's not because we know that something's happening, but it's to make sure that family gets assistance and help if needed. However, I've sort of followed this up with some statistics around mandatory reporting, and it's been a systemic issue for many, many years now that the number of reports that are given to statutory child protection agencies far, far outweigh the capacity of staff and other agencies to work with these clients. I mean, at one stage it got to proportions that were quite, I guess, endemic, and that's when we saw a change in the policy. Some of you may recall this change. It was within the last sort of decade, and the change was that initially, in New South Wales at least, we had to, as a mandatory reporter, report if we felt like a child was at risk of harm. And risk of harm was a term that defined lots of different things, but basically different ideas encapsulated within that initial definition. However, the threshold was then raised to risk of significant harm. So we're now encouraged to only report if a child is at risk of significant harm. The idea behind the change in this terminology was that reports would be reduced and that there'd be greater capacity to work with families, and those families at greatest need would be getting access to a service. There's some really interesting literature around all of that too, so please let me know if you'd like some ideas on where to look. Problems of measurement. So this is about the incidence of cases. So the number of occasions of child abuse reported, investigated, substantiated and prosecuted, and the impact of the policy of mandatory notification. So as we saw on the previous slide, there was, in terms of mandatory reporting, the statutory body found, well, bodies across the country found a huge increase in families and children that were being reported, and in some cases the accusations or reports were not being substantiated. The prevalence, so the rates of child abuse amongst population of children of legally defined age. So societal constructions of childhood and what that is and whether that will change over time, because it has changed since historic definitions. And jurisdictional, that's another word I struggle on, differences. So definitions of child, definitions of abuse, differences in mandatory reporting laws, prevention strategies and statistical collections. As you're all probably aware, each state has their own unique statutory body for child protection. I can only really speak to the New South Wales experience in this instance, but I think that's problematic in itself. Each jurisdiction has different definitions for all of these terms and different reporting thresholds and that sort of thing as well. So as you can see, it can become quite problematic. I know another difficulty there is for when families can be transit across state borders as well. So some practice dilemmas. I don't mean to overwhelm you with all of these dilemmas. It's seeming like a lot of dot points now I look at it again. But I'll just pick out a couple to have a chat about today. I think number one there I've got is parental rights, and where these rights go. And sometimes in the experience of working with a child protection agency, parents can feel completely stripped of their rights, and that they don't actually have any rights. And that's I can only empathize, a completely really terrible experience. So we need to be really aware of that as practitioners as well. Deficits discourse is another one that I'd like to talk about. Child protection, statutory wise, inherently has a discourse of deficit. A risk assessment is completed looking for family deficits and all of the things that they're not doing right for the child. From a social work and social welfare perspective, we work in a strengths-based way of working. So this deficits discourse may not sit well with around our ideas of social justice and empowerment. Um, Structural causes is another really interesting one, and if you choose to do the topic in your assignment on children and families, it talks about what's the term? It's definitely structural, but I think some structural challenges perhaps is the question, and that's things that are really, as workers, we need to challenge. We need to challenge structural causes and question and acknowledge them. If a mum's having her child removed because she doesn't have a, isn't in a position to have a home to live in with her children, so her children are removed, is that a deficit for the parent or is that a structural issue? Is the fact that we're not helping that mum find housing and we're just going in and removing her kids because they're living on the streets her problem, or is it really a structural problem that we should be advocating for this mum and getting her into refuge and finding her housing and that sort of thing? So that's really an example of one structural issue that could be a consideration within practice. Gender again. So we spoke about gender in week 4, but it's sort of, I guess, an underlying current that ties together a lot of the topics in fields of practice. So again, we predominantly see women as clients in child protection. We also see them predominantly as carers and as practitioners. The idea of inadequate mothering and also attachment theory. I'm a huge fan of attachment theory, and I really urge you to get your head around attachment theory if this is a field of practice that you are interested in. Within the modules this week, I've popped in Mary Ainsworth's Strange Situation, a YouTube of that. And Ainsworth and Bowlby really built the base for attachment theory and did a lot of core thinking and developing ideas around it. So if you are interested, look up those two practitioners and please watch that YouTube. Attachment theory really underpins all of our work in child welfare. But not only that, I mean, our work with adult clients in counselling, in case management, in all of the fields, I think we can really relate attachment theory. So I'm more than happy to chat more about that, either in the Adobe sessions or on a forum. Just let me know. So again, similar to the other contexts of practice we've looked at this session, we were heavily influenced by UK and European approaches to child welfare. So we probably all have a bit of an understanding about the way that children have traditionally been treated within society, and the idea of a child's role and the role of the family or the role of the community and society's role and that sort of thing, and how that's quite different to the way we look at things now. I have this example here of boarding out, which was a paternalistic use of power by state in relation to child family and substitute family. The idea, oh sorry, I got family there twice. The idea was to rescue and reform. I guess I see correlations here between this boarding out in the UK and with our own stolen generation here in Australia. I mean, the idea and mentality behind that policy was to rescue or to save or to reform kids, and just crazy mentality. But that, I mean, that was what was underpinning this policy, and I can definitely see a correlation here. So here's another quote, which notes that the child in need of welfare assistance was regarded as the victim of an immoral and socially inadequate family situation, and the implementation of welfare policy usually resulted in the child being segregated from his or her family. So as you can see, again, quite punitive approach. Um, that's not to say that, I mean, similar things haven't continued to happen, but I think now in child welfare, we have a better understanding of the importance of attachment and the importance of family and primary caregiver bonds, and a little bit more about that later in the lecture. A tiny bit on the authority of the welfare system as a carer or custodian. So, for anyone who isn't familiar, at least in New South Wales, when a child is court ordered into care, they are the responsibility of the minister, which in itself seems really interesting terminology. I mean, they're not physically living obviously in the minister's house. They would have need to have millions of bedrooms, but just still that authority, isn't it? And that role. Which I think is really a unique and interesting concept. The state reserves the moral right to say who can best look after children, and when it comes down to it, that is how it is. And when we say it aloud, it seems almost too authoritarian, doesn't it? The law is explicit about the best interests of the child being the primary factor in attributing responsibility of care, but the state itself is a deeply flawed provider of care. And the law is wary to interject parental interests. So, I mean, often in the courts, what the parent needs or wants or what's in the best interest of the child is definitely taken into account in theory. And I'm sure everyone would be aware of situations that they know themselves where they can see this happening or they can see the alternate happening as well. So a continued high intervention rate with Indigenous families persists today. We talk about the stolen generation as having sort of a cutoff date, and a lot of the literature or the content that's out around that says, oh, well, up until 1970, there is a fairly great valid argument that it is continuing. We still see a higher rate of Indigenous kids taken into care than any other. We see an overrepresentation of Indigenous children in child protection, substitute care, and in juvenile justice. So I, for one, personally would argue that we still do see these things happening at a level that's too high, and we need to be thinking about ways as practitioners. Being aware of this is a really good starting point, but reflecting on that and reflecting what that means for our practice. So, what is a social worker's role in child protection? Bit of everything, I think. Risk assessment. Are we a technical expert? Can we define risk? Can we predict it? Can we differentiate high and low risk? And what are some of the underlying assumptions in this approach to human services in child protection? I think one of the big underlying assumptions is that the social worker is the expert, and I think that is completely wrong. I think that families are the experts of their own situations, and I think that as social workers, we have a level of knowledge and skill that can help families and guide families. But really interested in your thoughts on that as well. I would argue against the idea that we're the expert. I don't think that's accurate. So yeah, please, I'm not going to read through this whole quote, but have a read through it. It's a really good way of summarizing what I'm going to go into now, talking about the role that community and family and neighborhood can play in effective child welfare and protection. So one of the key ways of working for social work that's sort of come about in the last decade or so is the idea of early intervention. It has a social work theory base. It's a multi-dimensional approach. It's an ecological model. It's strengths-based, and it has a really good understanding of attachment theory and understands bonding and the importance of attachment for families and children. I'm just looking for some key points. Sorry, I know that we're getting up to the 20-minute mark. The idea of universal and targeted services is a really interesting one, and I'll move on to that a little bit with health promotion ideas. But basically, universal service is something that is offered universally and can be accessed by anyone. I guess I'm not sure if I think it is across all states. The Healthy Harold initiative, the giraffe that goes around in a van. I think if it is only New South Wales, anyone in the other states is just going to think I'm crazy. But it's a program that all primary school kids attend, and it's about healthy lifestyles and protective behaviours and that sort of thing. So that's your universal program. Not only kids who are at risk access that, but it's universal, and there's a number of them as well. We also then have targeted services, so services that are targeted at those children and families who are at risk. I added in this slide because I think as social workers, we really need to think about the way that we work with people who are parents. This first point is really important. There is a tendency to define parents as roles rather than people. A tendency in the field to say the mother or the father or the carer, rather than thinking, this is a unique person as well, in their own merit, and talking to them in that way. Parenting relationships with children are stressful, and underdeveloped. My terminology is probably a bit strange there, but parenting is stressful. It's a hard job, and we need to acknowledge that as workers. People generally respond better to supportive than directive interventions. It may seem really obvious, but once you get in the field and you're sort of working within an agency and within policy guidelines, it can be so difficult to remain positive and remain supportive and practice in a strengths-based way, rather than a way that's more sort of punitive and directive, especially in a statutory environment. And it takes time, as I noted on the slide. Um, and the last point's really related to finding answers not about stopping, it's about making alternatives and practicing them. So one of the key things within early intervention is that yes, we tell a parent that it's probably not the best idea to smack your child, but we give them alternatives. We say, come to a program and we'll show you some alternatives, or let us work with you one on one and give you some techniques and skills that you can use with your kid for behaviour management. So it's not sort of that don't do that or we'll intervene approach. It's let us help you, let us empower you, let us work with you to get the outcomes that you want to reach for your family. So I briefly mentioned population health models. So again, these emerged in response to the sort of public failure, as Scott 2006 notes, of child protection. The emphasis here is responding on community level disadvantage. It avoids just intervening at a crisis point, but responds to evidence-based need. So one key example here in New South Wales is a program called Kids Matter, which has been rolled out in primary schools. It's a mental health program for working with children. It was identified through research that there's a lot of mental health situations for kids and families that are going unaddressed, and reaching that crisis point where your statutory child protection bodies are having to jump in and intervene. But what if? What if we could have a model of working where we address these things at a universal level prior to them reaching a crisis point? Another key example of this universal population health model is what we talked about in week 4 when we were talking about gendered and family violence. We talked about what's the word? I'm really finding my words difficult this afternoon. The way of working that was domestic violence programs that raised awareness for the whole population, not just targeting those who'd experienced domestic and family violence, but raising awareness in the whole community as an approach to intervention. So in terms of prevention, schools are playing a role in terms of prevention of child welfare and protection. I also think that families play a really important role, and I think that families need to be supported in this role. I think that we live in a society where we sort of we look at things and we judge things and we say things to others, but are we being supportive? Are we empowering parents to do what can be maybe sometimes the hardest job they'll ever have to do? I think when we're looking at a universal approach, I think it comes down to all of us. It's not just these universal approaches that government has instigated, but I think it's as social workers and welfare workers, we really need to be advocating for these at an individual level ourselves. But that's all from me today. There's some references, and please jump on the forums if you have any further questions. Thank you.